Many Excel users consider pivot tables to be its most powerful feature. We've put together a 6-pack of tips to make your pivot tables better, easier to build, and even more powerful than ever. Let's get started. Our first tip deals with your source data for your pivot table. We strongly recommend that you convert your source data into a table before you build your pivot table. If indeed pivot tables are Excel's most powerful feature, then Excel's tables feature is likely its second most powerful feature. Among many other positive attributes, tables provide automatically resizing ranges of data. If you convert your data ranges to tables before you build the pivot table, then you merely need to refresh the pivot table each time the volume of data in the table changes. Now, on the other hand, if you build your pivot table using a traditional data range, such as the one currently shown on the screen, you will need to edit the data source each and every time the volume of data in that data range changes. To convert your data range to a table, simply click anywhere inside the data range, and from the Home tab of the ribbon, choose Format as a Table. Select your desired format, click OK, and that process is complete. Alternatively, we could have converted that range to a table with a Ctrl-T keyboard shortcut. Importantly, notice that now this range of data is converted into a table, and I go to the bottom of the range of data. See that once I type a new entry at the bottom, the table automatically expanded to include this additional row of data. And if we had already built our pivot table using this table as its data source, then all we would need to do now on the pivot table is simply click the refresh button, and the pivot table would automatically pick up the extra data as well. Our second tip is that if you're using Excel 2013 or newer, take advantage of the new recommended pivot table feature to automate the process of building your pivot tables. With recommended pivot tables, Excel will actually build your pivot table for you. How could it be any easier? To take advantage of recommended pivot tables, simply click in your data source, in this case the table that we constructed in our first tip, and then from the Insert tab of the ribbon, choose Recommended Pivot Tables. Upon choosing Recommended Pivot Tables, accept the layout that you want, and click OK, and Excel automatically constructs the pivot table based on its analysis of the data. Now, of course, the pivot table that Excel has created is just a starting point. Think of this as a foundational pivot table. We certainly are free to go in and manipulate this pivot table any way we want. For example, I will drag the transaction date field into the columns, and now my pivot table is showing me total sales by industry by year. Even if you're an experienced pivot table user, you can and should take advantage of recommended pivot tables to create these foundational pivot tables and then customize your pivot tables to meet your exacting needs. One note, if you use recommended pivot tables, you may in some cases receive a message indicating that Excel cannot complete the operation. If that happens, pay particular attention to the formatting applied to the data and change any cells to which the accounting format is applied to some other format such as the currency format or the general format. In most cases, that will take care of any problems associated with using recommended pivot tables. Our third tip deals with formatting. We strongly recommend that when you want to format your pivot table, you format the pivot table fields, not the cells within the pivot table. For example, with the pivot table currently shown on screen, perhaps I wanted to reformat that pivot table so that it did not display the decimal places. The common approach toward doing this is to select all of the cells and then apply the formats from the Home tab of the ribbon, such as reducing the number of decimal places. The challenge with this approach is if our pivot table later expands, then the formats that have been applied to these particular cells will stay with those particular cells, but any new cells now encompassed by the pivot table will not carry the same format. Therefore, a much better formatting option when you're working with pivot tables is to simply right-click on any value within the field that you want to format and choose the number formatting option. Choosing the number formatting option, in this case I want to apply the accounting format with 0 decimal places, and clicking OK creates what I like to term a sticky format. Now what's important about this format, and here you'll also see the power of using a table as the foundation of the pivot table, is if we go back to our transactional data and add a new row of data to the bottom, and let's put this in a miscellaneous category. Now when I return to the pivot table and refresh the pivot table, you will see two things happening. First, you'll see the new miscellaneous category automatically appeared at the bottom of the pivot table, and secondly, you'll see that the $100,000 associated with miscellaneous revenue in 2017 is formatted the same as all of the other cells in the pivot table. And again, this is happening because we applied the format to the field, not to the individual cells. Tip number 4, don't lose sight of sorting and filtering capabilities inside your pivot tables. For instance, as we look at the data in this particular pivot table, perhaps I would like this data sorted in alphabetical order. It was sorted alphabetically prior to me adding miscellaneous a moment ago, but I want to resort, so of course I can just click the drop down arrow next to row labels and choose to sort the data alphabetically. And now of course we see miscellaneous is in the middle of the pivot table. But also understand we have additional sorting and filtering options available. Again, clicking the drop down arrow next to row labels, I might choose not to sort in alphabetical order, either ascending or descending, but perhaps to choose more sort options. And when I choose more sort options, in this case I'm going to choose to sort the data in descending order, not based on the industry field, rather based on total sales. Clicking OK, now we see that our data is sorted in descending order based on the values in column E, the total sales column. Another option to pay attention to, of course, is the ability of filtering the data. Not only can we sort by clicking the drop down arrow, but we certainly can also filter. And perhaps I might choose value filter, since we're dealing with numeric data, and choose to show only the top 10 items. But perhaps I really don't want the top 10 items, perhaps I want to reduce that further to the top 5 items. Now I've filtered my pivot table to just the top 5 items in the list. Know that for both sorting and filtering purposes, you can apply your sorts and filters by clicking on drop down arrows directly in the pivot table, but you can also apply your sorts and filters by clicking on the drop down arrows inside the pivot table field list. Now in this example, I'm clicking on the drop down arrow next to transaction date, and see that I can go in and use the traditional checkbox approach to filtering data, but I also have available to me what are known as date filters. And if I choose a date filter, for example, let's say perhaps year to date, then the pivot table has just filtered to only the year to date transactions based on my Windows system clock. In other words, my Windows system clock is currently set to June the 18th, 2016. So when we go in and look at the transactions that the pivot table is filtered to, as you can see, it's only filtering transactions through June the 18th, 2016. Pay particular attention to these date-oriented filters when you're working inside your pivot table, because typically we're trying to summarize information from the past using relative summarization such as last month, last quarter, last year, and even year to date. Fully understanding the sorting and filtering options inside a pivot table allows you to make your pivot tables even more powerful than ever, because you can now use them to identify just the specific record sets or data points that are of interest to you at any point in time. Tip number 5. To gain even more insight into your data, consider adding pivot charts to your pivot tables. The old saying is, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so to make the data summarized in your pivot tables even easier to understand, consider constructing pivot charts. Pivot charts are simply graphical extensions of pivot tables, and they offer all of the same formatting options otherwise available with traditional Excel charts. The power of a pivot chart lies in the fact that they use the same pivot cache or data source as their related pivot table. Therefore, any changes you make to a pivot chart, sorting and filtering for example, automatically apply to the related pivot table and vice versa. Beginning with Excel 2013, it is no longer necessary to construct a pivot table prior to constructing a pivot chart. Yet for most Excel users, building the pivot table first and then constructing the pivot chart from the pivot table will be the easiest way of building a pivot chart. To build a pivot chart from an existing pivot table, simply click anywhere inside the pivot table, click on the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab of the ribbon, and choose Pivot Chart. Upon choosing Pivot Chart, as you can see, we have access to all of the charting options that we otherwise have anywhere inside Excel. In this illustration, we'll keep our chart relatively simple. Choose a column chart, click OK, and now you can see on screen we have a column chart that is constructed from the underlying pivot table. Now I'm going to slide this column chart down below the pivot table just to open up a little bit of room so we can see things a little more clearly. A few things of note on this particular chart. Importantly, see that pivot charts provide us with on-screen filtering capabilities. Suppose I'm not interested in all 3 years for which we have data. So I'm filtering the data by date. Also see that I can filter the data by industry. In this example, maybe I'll just select a handful of industries right up here at the top, click OK, and now I filter down my pivot chart to only the data points, to only the time periods, to only the industries in which I'm interested. Now what's very important about that is as we scroll back up to the pivot table, notice how the pivot table was also filtered accordingly. Remember, a pivot chart is simply a graphical extension of a pivot table, and if you make a change to one of these objects, then you necessarily have made a change to the other object at the same time. Our 6th and final tip is add a field to a pivot table multiple times and change the field settings on that field for even deeper analysis. As you can see, we're back to a very fundamental pivot table in this case, one that is just summing total revenue by industry. Now, what I can do on this pivot table is take, for example, the sales field and drag and drop that sales field onto the pivot table in this illustration 3 additional times. Remember, a pivot table is a cross-tabular report, and of course what that means is that every unique intersection of a column header and a row label, a pivot table performs a calculation. The default calculation is a sum function. However, there are 10 additional options available, including average, count, count of the numbers, a max function, a min function, a product, standard deviation of the population, variance, and variance of the population. In this illustration, perhaps I want to see the data in column C averaged instead of summed. To make that happen, I will simply right-click on any of the values in column C and choose from Summarize Values By the Average option. And now notice that the data in column C is being averaged. Likewise, click on any of the values in column D, right-click, and choose in this example to summarize the data by a min function. And now I'm seeing the smallest transaction for each industry. And finally, right-click on any of the data points in column E, Summarize Values By, and let's choose a max function, and we're seeing the largest value in each of those industries. Remember, every time we add a field to a pivot table, we get to choose the calculation that's going to apply to that field. And if the 11 calculations that are provided by default are not enough, do understand that you can add user-defined formulas known as calculated fields and calculated items to your pivot table for even deeper analysis. Of course, this 6-pack of tips is by no means a complete listing of all of the pivot table options you have at your disposal. However, it does provide some of the more relevant tools for making your pivot tables better, easier to build, and more powerful than ever.
On behalf of everyone at K2 Enterprises, thanks for taking time to view this tip. For more information on the training programs we offer, please visit our website at www.k2e.com.